Well, thank you for being a very disciplined audience and coming back from the coffee break in a timely manner. I'm Michael Green. I'm the Senior Vice President for Asia here at CSIS, and together with my colleague Kath Hicks, the Senior Vice President for the International Security Program, we co-directed this with Mark Kansian in the International Security Program, and relied heavily on the two gentlemen you heard earlier, John Shallis and Zach Cooper, to pull this complex multi-part report into a coherent piece of analysis and prescription. We're going to turn now to a panel of experts, some of whom Mark, Kath, and I were involved in the report, others of whom were not, to dive a little deeper into some of the issues that that Zach and John introduced earlier. And to my immediate right is Admiral John Greenert, a career submariner who was Chief of Naval Operations until very recently, served as the Pacific Fleet Commander, and with a long and impressive career in submarines and submarine command and fleet command. And one of the most important thinkers on the rebalance as it was being conceived and promulgated from the military perspective. Mark Kansian, who is at ISP, is a Marine Colonel retired and was in charge of land forces in the Office of Management and Budget. Andrew Shearer, to Mark's right, is now at CSIS, to our great delight, as a distinguished fellow. He served until recently as the National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Tony Abbott of Australia, and had previous posts here in the embassy as an advisor to the Australian Defense Minister on strategy. We'll do a bit of a round up here, and then I'll open it up for questions from the audience. But let me start following the recommendations that we had in the report that were briefed to you earlier, with the question of articulating our strategy and aligning our allies and our government and our commands around that strategy. We did a survey here at CSIS of elites in the Asia-Pacific region and found that outside of China, 80% were supportive of the rebalance. And even more remarkably, inside Washington, 97% were supportive of the rebalance. I don't think there's a policy issue in Washington where you'll find 97%, let alone 60%, agree with the direction and thrust of a policy. Conversely, in China, we found about 80% did not like the rebalance, thought that it was designed to contain China. We also found in that survey and in extensive interviews in the commands and in the region that there was some uncertainty about what the bottom line is for the rebalance to Asia. What is the strategic concept? What's the theory of the case? And as we looked at senior speeches by cabinet members, the president, we found a great variation, as Zach said, in how our priorities and our strategy are described, often responding to events, but in doing so, losing the leitmotif or the thematic line that held it together. In a way, that is understandable because this is a strategy, I think, that is not about defeating China in a war. It's about building partnership capacity, cooperation, patterns of cooperation, and integrating the Asia-Pacific region around a set of rules that eschew coercion, that are based on rule of law. And that problem has gotten harder because China has thrown its increasing weight, particularly in the maritime domain, in ways that friends like the Philippines and Japan and Australia feel quite strongly. So let me first pose this question to Andrew Shearer and to Admiral Greenert. It's not easy articulating strategy. This is not the clarion call of containment in the Cold War, but neither is it a kind of Pollyannish world of cooperation on transnational issues with no friction. From the perspective of a key ally in the region, what in the rebalance it has traction for strategic thinkers in Canberra, and what worries you or needs a clearer articulation?
Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks to the CSIS project team for what I think is a great report that unusually sheds light on a much debated subject rather than just heat and noise. I think, when I think what are your allies looking for from the United States, they're looking for a clear, consistent, coherent strategy. They're looking for the alignment of ways and ends and means behind that strategy. And in particular, they're looking for signs that the US is putting resources into developing capabilities that are needed to deter potential adversaries and reassure allies in the region. And I think one of the things that comes out strongly in the report is a sense that the speed of development of anti-access capabilities is really, in some senses, outrunning the development of new US capabilities and certainly allied capabilities. And therefore, I think the sense of urgency in the report's important. I totally agree with the finding in the report that there's a lot of support out there in the region for the rebalance, but there is also undoubtedly anxiety. People are worried about the pace of, in particular, Chinese weapons development. They're worried about Chinese coercive behaviour, and they're worried about this sort of sense that the balance of maritime power in particular is tipping. And then again, they worry about distractions, Russia, Ukraine, Middle East, ISIL. And fundamentally, I think they're looking for a sense of long-term commitment to this strategy, that it's going to survive changes in US politics, and obviously everyone's watching the US election closely.
Is it fair to say that in Canberra, the metric on this, the sense of the problem is growing? In other words, is this sense of urgency, does it date back to 2011 when the president first announced this in Australia, or has it grown because of the developments you've described?
Australia enjoys much more strategic depth than some of the other countries we're talking about here, but even for Australia, that sense of depth is, if you like, being collapsed because of the pace of capability development and what's happening in the region. So I think Australian policymakers are much more acutely aware now than they were perhaps 5 years ago that the capability edge we enjoy is being rapidly eroded, and therefore there is, I think, in Australia a sense of urgency around these problems. And when the white paper comes down from the government, I expect probably next month or in the next couple of months, you'll see more focus on maritime capability, you'll see a commitment to increase defence spending, and a sense, again, of urgency in our defence policy.
Admiral, you helped the White House develop the meat on the bone for a lot of this strategy, and also took a leading role in building confidence, building measures like QS, the Incidents at Sea agreement that included China. So, how do you think about the way we can articulate a strategy where we reassure allies who are increasingly anxious, but don't get into a negative spin with China that leads us down a path of sort of a containment attitude that makes things worse?
Sure. Well, first of all, congratulations on the assessment. I think it's pretty well written, and thanks for inviting me here. Usually when you talk about a strategy, you just describe an end, ways, and means. The ends really were never defined for the rebalance. Rebalance tended to be an initiative. I had a piece for the maritime part, for the security part. But then, of course, there's an economic part, a diplomatic part, and as your assessment said, a focus maybe on humanity in that element. So I think we need to, first of all, the Pacific region, Asia-Pacific region has changed dramatically since this all started around 2011. 2012, we put together a DoD strategy with a benchmark of 2020. We said, this is where we're going to be in 2020, okay? And that was approved. And so we're headed in that direction. Well, we're almost there. So is that it? And as you've stated in the report, and as people have often discussed, well, where's the economic and where's the diplomatic piece? So my point would be, I think we need to get a restatement of where we are and what is the ends. We've described sort of the ways, the means that would be the resources have sort of cycled. But I think we need to describe the ends and make that clear. And then our allies and those that worry about it can say, okay, you've stated the ends, now we have something to discuss. It's allowed to just drift around, and we spend a lot of time saying, no, it's not that. Well, then what is it? And we have a difficult time describing that. So we would have to go back to 2012, the last time we actually wrote something down and said, very discreetly, this is what we're going to get. It's time to lay that out in clear fashion. New administration coming in about a year could be a perfect opportunity for that.
Good.
Yeah, I want to pick up on exactly that theme, which is the effect of where we are with strategy inside the U.S. government. Obviously, we have a finding that it could be clearer and more consistent. It sounds like that's something that resonates, at least on this panel. Let me start with Mark. Actually, Mark, you know, as Mike said before, you came to CSIS from the Office of Management and Budget, where were you leading the Force Structure and Investment Division. And you know, you sat at the crux, probably one of the cruxes of this tension about what is the rebalance and what are the measures to show we're being effective. What is your sense about how the U.S. government can better align itself internally and with its components to execute the rebalance? Is it clarifying the ends? Is it more or different? What are your views?
Well, as you know, when the rebalance first came out, there was a lot of question about, you know, it's great as a concept. What does that really mean in terms of programs and forces? And I think the administration has been working over the last couple of years to put some definition there. The Navy has talked about putting 60% of its ships into the Pacific. I mean, that's a very tangible.
Air Force is the same.
And,
I think, yeah.
and the Army is doing, you know, Pacific pathways and doing more in the Pacific. So I think those specific actions, the programmatics behind them, are becoming clearer as the administration has sort of thought this through. You know, in the background, there's the question about money, and you know that has loomed over this entire concept. When it was initially proposed, of course, the department was at a much higher level of fiscal resources. The FY12 plan, the Gates plan, since then it's lost $500 billion over 10 years, and that has raised a lot of question about, you know, what you can actually do. I think that at the current level of fiscal resources, there's a pretty good answer. A lot of activity, a lot of engagement going on in the Pacific, but that's heavily dependent on what happens fiscally in the future.
Yeah. And Admiral Greener, you know, back to the ends piece, I think a lot of the tension in the interviews that we conducted that folks inside the U.S. government feel, and I'm sure is felt in the region by many other countries, is between embracing a China that can be a positive player on the world stage. It clearly has economic power. We have a desire to grow the relationship and at the same time deal with, if you will, the facts of its military capability development. Do you think there are ways to bring those two ideas together more coherently than we have in terms of laying out the ends of the strategy for the rebalance?
Well, I think certainly we need to engage with China. If we want to shape their behavior, you need to have a discussion. The small little example of our Secretary of State and the Minister from Iran solving a difficult problem with the sailors. I mean, if you don't engage, you can't solve the problem. So if we want to shape, we need to engage. And then we can have a discussion and clarify. We have cultural differences that are so complicated. Not engaging allows this thing to just spin into an area that takes so long to get back in the box. So engage while we're doing that, prevent miscalculation, and that gets to the QS, you know, the protocols for our forces interacting, because we're going to be out there together. And I think having a pragmatic discussion with them, my experience has been that at least the Chinese Navy knows we're not leaving. They recognize that. So now what are we going to do? And then they come to us for all the other problems because they realize, you know, that we do have a voice with the other allies. That can be interpreted as a problem between China and ourselves. Sometimes it is, but it's not always. It's like, you guys need to fix the other allies' part. We need to bring it into a more multilateral discussion. So there's a conversation among all of us, not just the Chinese and ourselves.
So the second basket of recommendations that we had was about building allied and partner capacity. We come into this problem set with two historical legacies, the hub and spoke set of bilateral treaties we have with Japan, Australia, Korea, and others, and since the Vietnam War, a general American retrenchment from the security problems of Southeast Asia. And what we're finding is that our bilateral alliances are, in some ways, too bilateral. We're not taking advantage of what we could. and that Southeast Asia now is really the center of a lot of the contestation about the future of Asia-Pacific order. Our recommendations focus on two areas. One is helping build capacity in countries like the Philippines so that they can deal with problems, sort of prevent great power rivalry, deal with disasters or other things on their own with some help from us. Let me start with Andrew on that one. I think this is also very much on the radar screen in Canberra and in Tokyo and in Seoul now. How do you see the alliances evolving to deal with this more complicated environment we're facing?
I think if you look at Australia's experience, we've been operating incredibly closely with the United States, particularly in the Middle East, for over a decade now. And we've made some very clear and deliberate choices. So, for example, if you look at our air combat capability, it's basically all US in its origin, and it's been designed as an integrated system that just networks straight into what the US is doing. So, some of those pieces are there with Australia. I think the next challenge, though, is sort of networking the bilateral hub and spokes alliances much more. And I think it's particularly important at the high end, for example, with Australia, the United States and Japan. I mean, that's a really solid place to start for a whole lot of reasons, but basically latent capability and high levels of interoperability make that a really good platform. But we need to start networking our ISR assets, we need to start networking our undersea assets much more, and the prospect of a Japanese, Australia, US developed submarine fleet for Australia, I think, would be a powerful driver of cooperation in that area. So we need to start fleshing out our amphibious networking and also areas like capability development and logistics as well.
We, in the US, spent about 1% of foreign military finance last year on the Asia-Pacific region. You know where most of it's going. And I think there's a commitment in the Department of Defense to move that up. But there's a lot more, it seems to me, we could do with Australia, with Japan, with Korea, that are helping Vietnam, the Philippines, with Coast Guard capabilities, infrastructure. The other aspect of it is whether our traditional bilateral alliances are as connected as they need to be. So one thing that Zach mentioned was our recommendation for a standing joint task force. We had that with 519 in the past. Our sense, we spent a lot of time on this, was you don't want to be standing up a joint task force in the middle of a crisis. It sends the wrong signals, and the relationships and so forth are awfully hard to build on the fly. Admiral, you weren't part of this discussion, so I'd like to hear now if we got it wrong or right, or how you think about the command relationships. We have a joint command with Korea. Japan is stepping up with new defense reforms. We're doing more with Australia, but we're not configured with command and control relationships to deal with a lot of these challenges when they hit. It's a command and control structure that's decades old, but maybe not up to the challenge. What's your take on it?
Well, 519, Joint Task Force 519 was instigated and put together really for conflict, as I recall. And so it would stand up at a certain, as things were evolving or devolving, depending on how you look at it. And then, again, it was structured for combat. Then the aperture opened and said, well, wait a minute, we need to shape. We're into a phase 0. Can we use 519 for that? It was determined, not really, because people have day jobs, and PACOM then said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to run the China campaign. I will absorb the attributes, if you will, of this 519. Compact fleet, you are my maritime component commander, U.S. Air Forces, et cetera, U.S. Army Pacific, and established really kind of, it's not a standing task force per se, but a broader campaign. And the focus became more how to prevent the conflict and make sure we're getting the phase 0 right. So to your point, should we not have a standing joint task force? Perhaps it has to have a purpose, because you can't stand the whole time. That's why we have COCOM in the theater. But one point I would add to it, if you're talking about a conflict, even with any nuclear state, any kind of cyber-capable state, it's not regional anymore. So we have to think broader than that, because you're going to have problems. It's going to be at least in the Indian Ocean for sure. So you're spilled over there. And even the small instances where North Korea isn't engaged in cyber activities, it's broader than that. So I think that thought process has to be put into it, or you'll just be doing a 180 or a 360, however you want to look at it.
Mike, I just would interject, from my perspective too, I think what you see played out through the de-evolution of 519 or the absorption back up into PACOM and, too hot, too cold, is exactly this debate also about how clear are the ends. What is it we want
Right.
PACOM, for instance, and the U.S.
Right.
military to be doing? Because with 519, the challenge was that at PACOM you didn't have the warfighting perspective pulled up. With 519 being absorbed, you had the chance to bring more of a, if you will, stronger military hard power perspective, but instead what happened is it absorbed into a different message. And so I think that's where these things come together. If you have a new administration that has a clearer strategy, understands how the components fit in that strategy and can spell it out, that can help the department in PACOM to decide how does form follow function, what is the right joint task force setup that makes sense for what we want the military to do. And I think from the CSIS study team perspective, we hope part of that is to take the military aspects of the China challenge seriously.
Which, we're dealing increasingly with gray zone coercion. And in the Korean case, our joint command structure, joint and combined command structure, the Koreans allowed us to develop plans for provocations and to counter provocations in a seamless joint way. I think that's part of the objective that we need to think about. How do we, with Japan in particular, have command relationships that allow us to work seamlessly in a short of war crisis, and do so based on exercises and plans that we have worked together. And our thinking after looking at this was you've got to have some kind of relationship. It's also why we recommended a joint operational command for Japan, which was not an original idea. There's a lot of discussion in Japan about this as well. And so we put forward one model, but these are the kind of considerations I think the next administration is going to have to take into account to try to align our command and control with the geographically and functionally broadening challenge as our allies and partners begin doing their own serious planning and thinking about it. So maybe not fully solved, but we put something forward to get the debate started.
So a big emphasis in the report and what Congress was looking for is on posture, which I'll leave to Mike to raise in a few minutes, and then on the capabilities that the U.S. is developing. Of course, there's been this significant effort within the Department of Defense to look at the challenges posed by anti-axis area denial adversaries, with China being the pacer for most of those threat areas. And so the CSIS team went through and looked really quite comprehensively across land, air, sea, space, cyber, and then support areas. And maybe, Mark, if we can start with you, I'd love to ask all three of the panelists here, what did you find most striking and or surprising in terms of the conclusions that you think are important? Conclusions in your case, because you're part of the study team that you agree with. You all can raise issues you don't agree with. But what really struck you in terms of the capability areas that we examined?
I think the big thing that struck me on the capability area was the implications of the A2AD environment and the fact that the United States has not really thought deeply about that since the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, of course, we were facing a global, very sophisticated military threat. For the last 25 years, we've essentially operated in sanctuary. Our sea lines of communication, our air lines of communication, even our large basing structures have been in sanctuary. And I think we've become accustomed to thinking that those will all be protected and will not be threatened. And as we looked at the evolving environment, not just China, but North Korea also, it became clear that that's not going to be the case going forward, that all of these lines of communication are going to be under threat. And that as we think about it, for instance, as we run our strategic mobility models, we're going to have to accept the notion that we're going to lose some assets. that wasn't part of the previous analysis. So people have been talking about A2AD for a long time, but I think that what's new is actually changing the way we operate and some of the things we buy.
Andrew, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, I think your allies really are looking for signs that the US system is responding to the speed at which this kind of capability advantage is being eroded. And you know, we followed the debate about air sea battle with interest and a little bit of befuddlement, and the subsequent evolutions of that. And I mean, I think to go back to the start of the conversation, you know, starting with clarity about strategy and then seeing signs that there's a real intent to build the set of capabilities you need to operate in this much more contested and kind of congested environment is what your friends and allies are looking for. And I think one of the great things about the report is that the cumulative effect of the recommendations, I think, starts to take you down a pathway towards developing it.
Great. Someone Brainerd?
I have a little bit of a different approach. I think folks, the idea that the United States military could roll back any force, any anti-access area denial, which was a term put for the reality there. We didn't define anti-access area denial and then people built toward it. We said, hey, we're in a situation of anti-access area denial. So the idea that, well, we'll just roll all that back because we can and we should always build to that, I think is wrong. And people, a long time ago realized that that's not going to work. Air-sea battle is really about that. It is about being able to get access where we need to, when we need to, for as long as we need to, for very, very different situations, not always combat, not always in the Asia-Pacific region. So my point is, I thought the report, the assessment, did a fine job saying, hey, about this anti-access area denial, how are you going to do this? And I think that's a good point, because I think there has been good thought going on in the Pentagon on this, that the approach to a potential conflict out there has to be approached differently. Put another way, we won't steam or fly or just drive into the South China Sea or the East China Sea. And that went away quite some time ago, that whole idea. And air-sea battle is about how do we bring people up thinking broadly, not just about that, and how do you get access in a situation where you have this thing called anti-access area denial. So the point I think in the report is we need more clarity on how you're thinking that, because people think that's still the plan. We're going to roll in there and roll it back. And when you look at the potential adversary or whoever and that's not the only place, and you say, yeah, but the capabilities to do that are mismatched. Of course they are. Yes, they certainly are. And perhaps we need to clarify the plan. I mean, much of it is classified, but the idea is maybe back to the air-sea battle and say, maybe we need to open the discussion on that one more time. It's been a long time. I'm not proposing it, but it might be there.
Yeah, just to preview for those who surely have not yet read the 300-page report, we do sort of take a two-prong approach to this issue of, if you will, how to innovate, what are the ways in which you can defeat the challenge of anti-access area denial adversaries. And we're focused in this report on the Pacific. So we looked at two areas. One is how to minimize threats, if you will, to our existing capabilities, how to best operate, if you will, a rollback, for lack of a better term, how to best operate today. So that includes areas like missile defense, notably, making sure we have the right munitions, things of that sort. And then the second is this idea of how do you experiment and develop new approaches. Air-sea battle is certainly in the line of
Sure.
operational concepts, the family of operational concepts that make sense in this space, and how do you continue to push the envelope in that area. So those are the two big things, and Mike, if you'll give me a little patience, just to follow up on that, and we don't have to come back to it. I'd be really curious to hear thoughts on what those barriers to innovation are that are most important for the United States to overcome if it's going to meet this challenge? And I'll just open that up to anyone who would want to comment on that.
Barriers to innovation?
Yeah. What kind of culturally and organizationally, institutionally, should we look to be assessing and maybe changing if we're going to be faster, if we're going to close this?
I'm tainted as a former service chief, so
Yes.
I'll go right to that.
Absolutely.
We need to be able to take new developments in the maritime sense out to sea sooner and test them.
Yep.
And see if they have some relevancy and if they have potential, and then allow that to expand.
Pilot projects. if you will,
Exactly.
in a
And
general
so
sense.
we should invest in those, and then we should find those that have great, and there are obviously, I mean, Secretary of Work, that's kind of part of that third offset piece he's talking about. But we really need to push that out. That is a barrier to innovation. I think if you see that, and people who are developing, and they'll say, hey, this thing actually gets out there and gets seen sooner, and I think you'll get more, you'll have companies, and I think R&D folks, more willing to do that. But we just need to get things out there and see if they work sooner. That's my opinion on that.
Let me agree with the Admiral on that, because putting on my OMB hat, as soon as you attach a procurement program to a project, now it is a multi-billion-dollar effort. It gets a lot more scrutiny, and it's much harder to push through the system. If it is a demonstration of some sort, you get a lot more latitude. And you also get latitude to fail. I mean, if a relatively small pilot program fails, then these things happen. If a multi-billion-dollar procurement program fails, that's a huge deal.
And just to add 2 cents on this, it will be important, I think, to have high-end, technically capable allies, Australia, Japan, Korea principally, involved in some ways, and ease the movement from R&D to development so that it is easier for federated defense. And with F-35, with missile defense, it's becoming obvious that for a host of budgetary and technological and interoperability reasons, the old model where we develop systems and then adjust them for export is going to be extremely time-consuming and inefficient in terms of cost. So the opportunity extends to our partnerships as well. Let me segue to, I think our last comment before we open up.
May I make a comment on that, please? I think in my opinion, a big key to what you said, which I agree with, would be we have to look at the details of our information sharing.
Yes.
So we'll have to be willing to take risk. If we think we have a laser gun, which we're out there demoing, I don't think we've gotten that back yet. They won't give it back. And we said, hey, this is great. We need to open it to our allies. It's so new that our current mandates will preclude that. And that's a risk we'd have to be willing to take.
That's right. We're very slow bringing allies into this technology development. We got into this business in 2012, actually, when we did a previous rebalance assessment for the Congress, because the Senate and House Armed Services Committee could not understand why they were paying for military construction for new housing in Guam, facilities, and distribution of our presence to Australia and within Okinawa. And that's why we were asked to do this study in 2012, in part to explain the strategy that would clarify why we need a more distributed presence. It has bearing on all these operational and strategic issues we're discussing. So I thought we'd end the discussion before opening it up by asking the panelists, is that still a legitimate concept? Why do we need the Marines and the Air Force in particular to have a more distributed lay down and access across the region? And are we on pace? Are there things we need to pick up? I'll start with Andrew, because you were just living this in the Australian government at the receiving end.
Yeah, I think good progress is being made out there with this, and I do think it's important from an Australian point of view, the opportunity to have the Marines in Darwin for 6 months of the year, to have them with us for Talisman Sabre, our biennial high-end training exercise, is invaluable, especially as we try to stand up a new amphibious capability. So that, I think is fantastic, and we've got to the point where I think it's about 1,200 Marines on each rotation, and that's good. What I'm looking to see is further progress so that we can get to the the agreed end state, which is 2,500 Marines, and there's some issues with cost sharing that are being worked through. That's taking a little bit of time, and I'm confident that because of the long-term benefits from this for both sides, that will be resolved. But there needs to be a bit more urgency around that, I think. Likewise, the US Air Force rotations, that piece which requires some enhancements to our northern air bases, that piece really hasn't moved along as fast as you might have liked after it was announced in 2011. And then finally, I think the growing importance of the Indian Ocean should put the sort of naval rotations nearer to the front of the queue than frankly it's at the moment. And again, I don't think there's been all that much urgency around that, and there's some references in the report to that. So, a solid B, but more work to do to get an A+.
You don't have grade inflation in Australia. Admiral, we spent a lot of time talking about the A2AD challenge. A lot of these force posture initiatives started in the mid-90s, particularly around political challenges with Okinawa and so forth. Given the A2AD challenges, are we still on the right path trying to distribute the laydown of the Marines and open access for the Air Force and the Navy?
I think we are. It provides, first of all, it demonstrates the commitment we were talking about earlier of how do our allies know we're committed. Well, if you have sons and daughters out there on the ground, that's a pretty big commitment, your national treasure right there. Two, you can shape. There are innumerable examples of real-world issues happening, now that you can respond to and get it done. If you have to run something forward, it's just going to be there too late. In the world we live in today, that's my opinion. And you can get an understanding of the area should you have to go to conflict. And you can shape the area to prevent the conflict. And I believe there's a synergistic effect that the whole is bigger than the parts of being out there and distributed and operating with your allies. The day-to-day kind of picture of being in and among your allies sends to a potential adversary, I'm not dealing with one, I got to deal with all four of them. And it's more than a military dimension. It's a political dimension, an economic dimension of what you're up against should you choose to be that adversary, if you see what I mean. And I don't think there's a nation necessarily too small, that can be part of that.
Yeah.
That coalition.
And I think that, go ahead, Mark.
Well, no, I was just going to add one thing to the Admiral's comments, which is the tyranny of geography. I mean,
Yeah.
all of us think of Guam, for example, as being way out in the Pacific. In fact, it's a long way from the South China Sea. So developing the distributed basing allows you to be close to whatever contingencies or events take place when our existing structure really is not all that close.
I think what you're saying is becoming very clear to our allies and partners who are in these discussions with us, whether it's the Philippine Supreme Court giving a green light to the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, the Abe administration's commitment to the Okinawa realignment despite some political challenges, the continuity in Australia from Labor to two coalition governments. The devil's always in the details. Who pays for the parking lot? Who pays for the golf course?
Yeah.
So it's going to need, I think, some...
That's not an issue with Marine Basin.
No, never the golf course.
No golf course.
I think it's going to require some new push and focus from above to keep it moving, as Andrew said.
I would say, I don't think you need to go from zero to base. U.S. base, we're in there with infrastructure and that's a huge step for any country to do that. A place, whatever you want to call it, with that you have an agreement and say, we'll be there only for this reason, blah, 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 and be willing to do that. There is this perception that started sweeping through Southeast Asia. Part of the rebalance was, here we come, we want to build bases. As we all know, that's very pricey to us, hard to get support for, but at the right place at the right time, landing rights and access with partnerships, I think goes a long way. Pre-staging, so that and it can be for, obviously, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief.
And the interesting thing is, a lot of these countries want to do it with Japan and Australia and India and Korea and others as well. They want more presence from all the maritime powers that care about stability. Let me open it up to questions from the audience. Please raise your hand, you got that part right, and then identify yourself and keep it fairly brief. Yes, sir. Standing up, and
Hello, Dan Vasquez, CEO of IntelliWings and former Deputy Director of Intelligence for U.S. Air Forces in Japan. With the increase of U.S. forces coming to Japan, such as the stated intent to station a V-22 Special Ops unit with over 1,000 airmen at Yokota Air Base in Japan, that's likely to increase tensions with China and maybe Russia. Should there also be some kind of parallel effort to increase confidence-building measures with China and regional powers with activities such as combined search and rescue exercises or other activities to increase a dialogue so any increase in U.S. force posture doesn't get perceived as intended to threaten China? Just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, let me start on, I'd like to hear from the Admiral because he really, I think more than any other service chief, opened doors and relationships with the PLA Navy, with QS and other things. And in many ways, although the Admiral should comment on this, but I think even though measured in public opinion polls and editorials and other things, U.S.-China relations have actually become quite tense over the last 6 years or so. The middle-to-middle relationship somehow has moved forward, I think. My answer to your question would be that middle-to-middle piece and CBMs are critical. You have to be very careful not to undermine allies' confidence in your commitment, but I think there's a lot of room to do this without that problem. I think there's a larger problem we've gotten into, which goes back to the first recommendation we have, which is the consistency of how you articulate U.S. interests, ends in Asia. When you're focused too much on process, on agreements, on the ways and means, and aren't clear about the ends, then you leave the ends to the imagination of our friends and adversaries. And I think the next administration is going to have to, from the beginning, lay out a candid but constructive vision for U.S.-China relations. The Obama administration came in and took the Bush formula, comprehensive, cooperative, and candid, and they took out candid and added positive. And then after a couple of years, they started getting candid again. I think that the theory of U.S.-China relations should be optimistic on the whole, but it should be realistic. And the next administration, I think people realize that the next administration is going to have a theory of the case that avoids inconsistencies, because that inconsistency in the national level strategic message can make things worse in ways that even a good mill-mill relationship can't entirely fix. But Admiral, you were there making this happen.
Sure. I think it's a good point that you make, and I think, yes, we should have a conversation. So let me go back to the island building. When we saw the island building going, I had a conversation with my counterpart in the Chinese Navy, Admiral Wu Shengli. I said, what are you doing? And he said, well, we're just building this up to support our forces and all that. I said, you didn't tell anybody. And he said, we won't use this for military operations. I said, okay, that's nice to know, but nobody knows that but you and I now, which is a little bit assuring to me. But and he said, this is kind of our business. These are our islands. That's a separate issue, right? Because we don't believe that, and we say based on what? So hold that aside. I said, why don't you tell everybody that? And he said, well, yeah, I guess maybe we ought to do that because we're people of action. We should, and not so much talk. So my point would be, goes the other way too, I think. And so a clarity of what we're doing, and if there's pushback, we are allies. We are stationed there. So hey, this is the way it's going to be. I think candid conversations have to take place. Or, to your very good point, the ends are left to the imagination, and they'll always go in the wrong direction. They just tend to. And now you're trying to put that back in the box, and it's just too hard to do. It's goo all over the place.
Ambassador, up in the front. Right.
I'm Jose Cuisha, the Philippine ambassador. First of all, we commend CSIS for this very timely and I think very comprehensive study on the Asia-Pacific rebalance. I have a question for Admiral Greenert. Last week, the Philippine Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement between the U.S. and the Philippines and ruled that it is an executive agreement, thus not requiring ratification by the Philippine Senate, a decision welcomed by many people in both the U.S. and the Philippines. However, China came out with a very strong statement, severely criticizing the U.S., that this would raise tensions further in the region. On the other hand, China has ignored the 3 halts that the U.S. has advocated for the claimant parties in the South China Sea. No reclamation, no construction, no militarization. The first 2, we know that they have already undertaken reclamation 7 reefs. They continue to build. They have built airstrips, ports, and communication facilities. And in terms of militarization, while President Xi Jinping has said they don't intend to militarize, Admiral Swift, Pacific Commander, 7th Fleet Commander, came out, in fact, with a warning last December 14 in a security forum that China was building military zones around these artificial islands. My question, Admiral, is don't you think that this is really a prelude for China taking control over the South China Sea, which could then imperil the freedom of navigation principle that the U.S. so strongly advocates?
So your question is China taking control of the South China Sea? Is that your question?
This is the prelude. The fact that they're building these military zones, that they would then be able to control the South China Sea.
Well, I don't agree that they would be able to control the South China Sea with what they've built and with what I see out there now. Clearly they're impacting it, clearly they're influencing it, clearly they could conduct operations, military operations from it. The other side of that is it's very difficult to maintain and sustain a little base on it. I mean, you got to have power, you got to have water, blah, blah, blah. And so it wouldn't last very long in a conflict. But to my point, we are where we are is sort of my opinion. They're there and they're on them. So what are we going to do? So one, get clarity of what militarization, and we are collectively working on that. What do you mean by militarization? So that, again, it kind of gets to, we can figure out what are your ends in this so we understand that. And the more we chase that, at least there's conversation in that whole thing rather than letting the imagination run wild. Then an agreement for how you're going to use these things. And I'm not saying we just accept it necessarily, but try to get clarity because we clearly have a lot of allies and a lot of folks down there. They're very anxious and it leads to unintended consequences. So that, I do not believe that they are, I don't know what a military zone is yet, so I'd have to kind of understand. It's a term that I don't know there's, how do I say this, definitively defined in legal or other terms. But a general term, I could probably understand that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd add my 2 cents on this. I think the Admiral's right. A rollback strategy, thinking we can reverse this, is just not realistic.
I don't think so.
And so we need to do a lot of what the Admiral said. I think the other side of that coin is we want to dissuade Beijing from thinking, at each step we'll, ask them to define it, and we'll find a way to deal with it. I think in parallel to what the Admiral said, we need to do a lot of what we're doing and what we recommend in the report, which is helping states right there, like the Philippines with capacity. Freedom of navigation exercises is a lot of focus. That's just one tactic in a larger toolkit. This is my brief opportunity to advertise another project we're doing at CSIS to think about counter-coercion strategies. And what's the broader toolkit? You can't throw this all in the Navy. There's got to be a diplomatic trade and a geopolitical piece to how you avoid a dangerous spiral but dissuade escalation. And we don't have the answers yet, but watch this space.
If I may, we recently had a conversation. We would be some retired admirals and generals, Chinese and U.S., and so now I am that. So they said, what's going on with this freedom of navigation stuff you're going? And they folks generally, my conclusion, did not understand. We have been doing freedom of navigation steaming through the South China Sea, through the Spratlys, for decades. And they said, no, you just started. I said, the only reason you think we just started is because you're there now and you actually see it. And by the way, we don't linger there. We don't have time. They're just rocks. And by the way, the charts there are not well defined. And so continuing to make sure that we are not allowing them to change our behavior there and steaming through there and do freedom of navigation, I believe is important. Or they are shaping it, and to your point, they are controlling the South China Sea. that makes sense to you.
We've been doing fun ops, as they're called, in the South China Sea since the 1830s, with the brief and understandable interlude of 1942 and 43. So there's a long history. Other questions? Yes, sir. In the
My name is Vishnu Paudel. I'm a professor in ACCT. My question is, in the context of all strategy that we are discussing and the diplomatic global context, is there any linkage with NATO?
Do you want to?
There is, I don't want to use the word linkage, there is coordination with, U.S. is already inside NATO, so with NATO from a U.S. perspective is U.S. on its own, U.S. with allies and partners in the region, and then extra regional to include NATO allies and partners. And absolutely, we did a study prior to this, I'll just point to Mike and I and some others on federated defense in Asia, which Mike made reference to the term before, but it's about networking capabilities. And we brought into this report very much that same idea that in order to develop the best possible structure of capabilities, reassurances, et cetera, you want to bring to the table that broad network. That is an asymmetric advantage, frankly, for the United States and its allies and partners, is that alliance, the ability to build and sustain alliances and partnerships. So the UK in particular has been very interested in Asia and continuing capability there. There are long historic relationships, the French and others, that are important. NATO as an alliance has been trying to figure out what it wants to do about the rebalance, which is yet a separate and related topic. And I think it's fair to say that Europe is currently very distracted by both the migration crisis, probably primarily, and then secondarily, Russia on the eastern border post-Crimea annexation. So the effort that had been underway very actively in about 2014 inside NATO to think about what is the NATO piece of, or the partnership to the US rebalance strategy, that has been sidelined, deep thinking on that, as NATO as an alliance has been focused on these other areas. But again, European allies, and then even in the NATO context, there is definitely thought about how, for instance, Chinese coercion relates to, for instance, Russian coercion, Iranian coercion, et cetera, and what the state of deterrence is in the world.
The Admiral was just making an important point, which is when you look in the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean, the Chinese are there, the Japanese have a joint base at Djibouti, Australia and Korea are there. So we're actually, our Asian allies are operating with our NATO allies in real time as we talk. I think we also need to look at a geopolitical level at the EU and key European partners who do not see the problem we're describing the same way we do. And we're not talking about war fighting here, or certainly not exclusively war fighting. We're talking about gray zone challenges and coercion where alignment among rule of law, maritime trading states on a global level is going to be very important to encourage cooperation and discourage coercion. I saw a hand over here.
Mike, I just want to make one alibi, which is we do have a section of our report which was mandated by Congress on the Arctic, and that is definitely an intersection of European interests and Asian interests. So I encourage you to read that portion of the report.
In the back there, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Matthew Cosner. I'm on shore duty at the Department of Energy, and I've also, like the Admiral, spent a fair amount of time underwater. So in this study, I like the fact it talks about innovative capabilities and concepts. And a couple years ago, Admiral, you were here talking about this, and you mentioned one I think was an innovative concept. It was balance will succeed based on relationships, not forces. And somebody asked you what that meant about good relationships with China. And you said, you know, when two commanding officers in their late 30s meet at sea, the first thing they do isn't that they get mad at each other and start arguing about I should be here and you shouldn't be here, but that they can have some kind of a talk about what needs to be done together and how to make things good. I was wondering, 2 years now advanced to today, is that still an important part of UC as good relationships with China? And how have we done over the 2 years at getting closer to that piece at that 05, 06 level? Thank you.
Well, I think it is an important part of good relationships with China, but that's not going to be the enduring part. You know, there's the broader, we need policy, we need leadership direction at the top to enable people to do that. But Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, Q, is a result of that endeavor to not have folks do what you just described, have those little anecdotes. They're coming along quite well. Actually, QIS is being adopted by many. It's written, and we actually track the interactions, and so do the Chinese, and we're disputing down to the eaches. It needs to go to the Coast Guards, in my opinion. Admiral Wu Xingli believed that would be a viable thing. So that's on the agenda for the international fora that take place in the maritime sense. We also have a PCO, Prospective Commanding Officer Exchanges. Their prospective commanding officers come over to the U.S., not every one, a whole gaggle of them. Twice a year, they go up to Newport, to the surface ship school and blah, blah. And we go over to Beijing and to, I think, Qingdao, one of the bases. So it's more than just, that kind of piece at sea. It's kind of understanding who these folks are at your level. That's the future, not my level and the others. I mean, we come, we go at the top. We can put the things in place, but I still believe it will be resolved by the people who are 04s, 05s now and out in the future, realizing that, wait, before we get into something we can't get out of, before we provide a miscalculation, then now we stick our diplomats, if you will, and our civilian leadership with some. We think about this first.
Other questions? I've done this side of the room. We'll give this side a chance. All right. Yes, here in the aisle.
Yeah, Bobby Pestronk, just a citizen of the U.S. Be interested in each of the panelists' perspectives about how widely shared the Admiral's whole government approach to strategic engagement is, or whether there is conflict within the U.S. government and between the U.S. government and other governments about that kind of approach. It seems like a reasonable approach to me, and it seems like the kind of approach that works reasonably well domestically also in terms of response to emergency and disaster and even to day-to-day events.
Specifically, you mean engagement with the PLA or more broadly?
Well, I understand the Admiral's perspective that it's not simply a military capability which will assure, which will prevent military engagement. It's a humanitarian engagement, it's a political engagement, but as a citizen, I don't read about that kind of approach very, very often. And I don't know whether that's because there's conflict within the U.S. government or whether there's conflict between the U.S. and other governments about that kind of approach. And I suspect that if we're talking about the Chinese, from a Chinese perspective, our presence in their part of the world looks much like to paranoid folks in the U.S. about the Chinese expansion in their part of the world.
You want to start?
Well, as we know, there's huge economic interface because we have collectively, we're in China, with businesses. So that part is there. I think you would agree, right? I mean, there's a lot of that going on. There's some good scientific interaction going on, and I think that will help us get, my opinion, to the cyber issue. Yeah, and our presidents said that. They want to move on in that regard. To me, that's not going to be a military or a security issue. In other words, they're not going to solve the cyber issue. It's the other piece, and it will be I think a science and technology. My opinion is some people view an interaction with somebody who is not behaving in accordance with what we would call the international norms is a reward for them. And there's this thing called, reciprocity. We're inviting them over to do this, that, or the other thing, or we provide what they ask for, and they're not doing their part of it. My opinion is a great power looks beyond that sort of stuff, and I think if we keep the ends in sight, the big picture, we need to work and balance that part. And maybe agree to do a little bit more, but not on a continuing basis where you're being taken advantage of, if you know what I mean. It is my opinion that there's too much snipping about every small step, particularly with China. I mean, as a service chief, I could pick up the phone, I could converse and do all kinds of things with a whole ton of navies around the world, except for one. And that was done very, very small. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that these aren't important matters, but the other side is we need to continue on with that and not make every single interaction a great broad thing. It has to be, to the freedom of navigation piece, one little activity going through, that has to be more routine. So we can build up enough data and enough interaction to figure out where are we going to go with this and to properly measure how we're doing. Does that make sense to you, what I'm saying? Hopefully. Is my point of view shared within the Department of Defense, you mean? No. No, not widely shared. I don't know what widely is, but some feel, and I do understand their point. I just disagree with it, that we can't have this broad open thing. It's a reward for them. It's playing right to their, that would be the Chinese, the PLA, what they need, and we're giving them too much. We'd have to measure what we're given. But I think you got to take risk if you're going to shape somebody, and you got to go in there. And a great power, in my view, defines that risk and is willing to take more of it. Because to me, the end state is important and too important to muddle along, and time is not necessarily on our side collectively.
I was in the Bush administration. I was the senior Asia guy at the NSC, and we had much bigger arguments about this 13, 14 years ago than the administration does now. I think Admiral Greenert is on the right side of history. There is a broader consensus that we need these channels. Where there's less consensus, even still, I think, is the nature of the problem. And I think there was a considerable body of opinion in this town, not just in the administration, that what we were seeing in 2012, for example, from China was the result of internal political tensions, nationalism, sort of not a strategy. And there's more of a view, I think, in the region and in Washington. My sense is that there is, all these are factors, but there is a strategy in Beijing to extend denial and then control out in the maritime domain, and pretty deliberate. And that makes these other debates a lot harder. If you start to have some coherent concept of the problem, then when you're looking at mill-to-mill, it's not defining the whole relationship. It's all for the good. Because if you conclude we have a challenge and we need to deal with it by building up our alliance and so forth, then you need these kinds of relationships even more. So I think to the extent we understand the problem, the mill-to-mill relationships, the kind of things Admiral Greenert did, are going to be very strongly supported. But the debate now, in some ways, is really more about what's the nature of the problem with China.
Needs to be tangible, not just a bunch of come on over and I'll show you stuff, we'll go to dinner and stuff, chit chat, blah, blah, blah. It needs to, you got to get started, but then you got to get into the tangible and you got to grind through that to say, no, that's same old stuff as last time. We need to move to the next step, which is commitment, and tell them, you're a great power, you want to be a great power, we're going to have this new relationship, whatever that means, and help define what that is. And we need to move on in that direction, in my opinion.
Well, I know we have a few more questions, but we are out of time, so I did want to take a minute to very quickly recap and let you know where we're going and to thank everyone. So just as Admiral Greenert said, I think in his very first set of remarks, the environment has evolved rapidly, obviously around the world, but certainly in Asia. The allies and partners, particularly a number of the partners, have themselves in the past even 18 months substantially shifted to a, if you will, a more worried posture with regard to China than they had been. And of course, Rebalance is not simply about China, and in fact, there are many other initiatives that are now underway in Asia, again, that were not present even 2 years ago, and an increasing move, as Mike has pointed to have the allies taking on more of the mentoring role, the partnering role, and the move out of just strictly bilateral relationships into multilateral relationships and other approaches. And then, of course, the U.S.-China relationship has also been evolving through that entire period, and we should expect that to continue. What we've put forward in this report was written to comply with the statutory outline of what Congress was looking for, but we think we've captured really the main streams of activity and trajectories of where the United States ought to be going on the defense side, not the whole of government, but just the defense side of the rebalance. It will be at least as important for the next administration to be moving on the other tracks, the diplomatic and trade and economic tracks in particular, along with the defense track. So please, we welcome your feedback. We are planning to have further discussions now that we've released the report with Congress. I think Dr. Henry mentioned at the beginning there is a classified version of the report that we have provided to the Department and Congress that gets into detail you won't find in the unclassified, but I do think the unclassified gives you a very full and accurate representation of our findings, even at the classified level. So let me conclude by thanking first the panel, foremost because they all managed to dress themselves in gray pinstripe today, which was remarkable. Mark, you may not be able to see his pinstripe, but he comes from OMB, so he has sequester level pinstripes. They're very thin. Thank you in particular to Andrew and to Shearer and to Admiral Greenert for joining us for this discussion. We also had for this report, I think it's referenced even in the short report, that you have a senior review group. I want to thank the members of that senior review group who helped to shape this report. Chip Gregson, General Gregson is here in the audience, along with others who helped us on that. The study team, of course, John and Zach, but also you'll see this, if I can borrow your report, Andrew, this very large number of contributors. We are fortunate to have the best regional and functional experts in Washington. And we brought them all to bear on this report. So if you have an interest in any particular area or any particular country, there are folks there who can help with that. And finally, I want to thank all of you who came to join us today for this rollout, who asked questions, and those joining us via the internet. We look forward to working with you to create a more stable Asia. Thank you.